Hi, I'm Peter Hyman, Chair of the Boys Education Commission. Welcome to Boy Talk, a series of honest conversations with fascinating people about the challenges facing boys and young men. Today I'm speaking to Bill Lucas. Bill is a Professor of Learning and Director of the Centre for Real World Learning at the University of Winchester. He's an internationally renowned education reformer, and his research focuses on understanding those dispositions for learning which help people flourish throughout their lives, especially creativity and practical learning. He's worked in the UK and across the world on this. Bill has written more than 50 books and argues that schools should focus on developing all of the strengths of their pupils, academic and practical, formal and informal. Bill's acclaimed models of engineering habits of mind and of creative habits of learning are used across the world. They show that to engage young people, especially boys, we need to make our teaching methods more interactive, driven where possible by pupils' authentic questions. I've got to know Bill well over the last few years, and every conversation I have with him sparks fresh thinking. I know this one will as well. So welcome, Bill.
Great to be with you.
Let me start by asking you what kind of boy you were growing up.
I was pretty happy. I was busy. So actually, I probably nearly never had time to work out whether I was happy. I was outdoorsy. I was able to do things that my kids haven't really been able to do, like camp on my own, unsupervised with friends at the age of 12. I had a wonderful grandfather who encouraged me to use dangerous tools, again, largely unsupervised and probably not much loved by my mother. My mother was absolutely brilliant at getting me to do things like cooking from a very early age, so that when I did go off to university, I actually was a relatively accomplished cook. I look back with some concerns about my teenage years as I recall a rather uncool boy trying flared trousers and patterned polyester shirts and all of the above.
You've written a lot about dispositions and sometimes what you call habits of mind. First of all, can you just define that for us? What do you mean by that?
A disposition is a way of using your knowledge in a range of different contexts to meet your specific need. Whether it's dealing with a sat nav that lets you down and having to recall your basic map reading skills, or managing your emotions in the middle of a really tricky meeting. That meeting could be a classroom context or it could be an adult one. These are the habits that successful people exhibit throughout their life. And they transcend knowledge and skills and attitudes. And therefore, they're complex. And a world that likes to simplify the point of school doesn't really like them because they can't neatly fit into something called maths or something called science. But they do have a part in maths and science because they are things like perseverance, self-control, absorption, and especially the ability to manage the many distractions that come along. Planning, really important. We're learning a lot about planning, actually, especially for boys, whether you can move from a goal or objective into actually implementing whatever it is you think you want to do. Revising, empathy, really, really important, because unless you can read the mood of those around you, you're not going to flourish. And working with others, being collaborative. I guess something that moves across all of those, I'm not quite sure whether it's a disposition or not, would be something like oracy, which interestingly is rightly, I think, gaining in more prominence at the moment.
That's really interesting. And what you say about it doesn't fit neatly is often the charge against it. So we default back to thinking, well, we've just got our maths lessons and our history lessons and all the rest of it. So where do you put it in the school day or the curriculum? How do you get young people thinking intentionally about this so that they can really improve these habits that you talk about?
Well, your question and your use of the word intentional has, I think, half of the answer. You need to understand within science where a particular aspect of what I'm describing as a disposition might be most helpful. And it might be in the expression of curiosity or critical thinking or complex investigation or deep inquiry skills. And then you need to embed it in science and maths and geography and physics and everything else. So part of the answer is systematically understand where these might be useful. So don't invent them, look at where they occur naturally. And then, because you want to do this intentionally, also think, so which areas of the curriculum are a little light on these, where it might be helpful, for example, to be more collaborative, or helpful, for example, to focus on perseverance when you find this really tough or difficult. Now, that's just the formal curriculum. We then need to move out into the co-curriculum and think about all those things that happen around the edge of the school timetable, out into the extra curriculum, and something I know you really value, Peter, out into the community curriculum, whether that's activities from home or activities in the workplace. And no one aspect of these is more important than another. But if we're going to answer the school question, it has to sit within the formal curriculum. It has to be normal. I mean, it doesn't need to be something we need to have a big debate about. Does knowledge matter rather than skills? Because they both matter. And it's a preposterous, silly, false binary to get dragged into that debate.
But are they, for some people, these are quite elusive, these habits or dispositions, because I've seen examples where some people say there are four of them, you know, the four C's. Some people have 8, some people have 16, some people have all the ones you've talked about and add to that a sense of humour or whatever it might be. So is there in your mind a hierarchy that these are the 3, 4, 5, whatever the number is, that really matter, both in school and life? Or, on the other hand, does it not matter which we pick, as long as we're being intentional about it?
Well, if I was being mischievous, I'd ask you which subjects do you think are the most important, Peter? And you'd possibly default to maths and science and literacy or English. And there is a kind of central trio, I think, here, and they are around perseverance and mindset, what Carol Dweck calls growth mindset, what Angela Duckworth calls grit. So these are generic learning attributes that can be applied anywhere. Now, by the way, there is an issue as whether it's more difficult in maths or on in the playground or at home. We can leave that for now. But so that would be really important. And that's kind of your core learning attribute. And then I think there are, and these probably are C's, especially in an AI dominated world. I think critical thinking is right up there as something which is a complex skill. Part of the difficulty of answering these skills is how complex does a skill have to be a complex skill? But that's no different from asking, as I've done, an engineer or a scientist to tell me what the 3, 4, 5 most important things of being a scientist or an engineer. They can't answer that. They can roughly answer it, but they can't say, here is a definitive answer.
Yeah.
The third one I would put in is creativity, because unless we're prepared to think new thoughts, we really are doomed as a species. And the final one is around a social emotional aspect here. And you might call that collaboration or collaborative problem solving. And if you look at the literature, there are a number of us around the world who've examined this, not in this podcast, because that would drive your watchers and listeners bonkers, but I could very happily supply the data that suggests that we're pretty united on what these things are, just as the OECD is pretty united, for example, or the World Economic Forum, on what the core subjects that we need to teach kids are. So it's a debate which is a non-debate, and it is normally articulated by those who don't want to know the answer.
And do you think that's really interesting? Do you think there's a particular boy lens on this? In other words, is the fact that these things are often not treated intentionally in school, um, is that sort of hurting boys' education?
I think so. Um, we know that there are. I'm really cautious about this, so I've slowed down
Hmm.
because I think the most of what I say is true for boys and girls.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
think there's something that we're learning about motivation, about self-control, about empathy, about how boys deal with what is often described as an advantage to boys, namely a competitive environment. And on closer analysis, it turns out that some boys switch off because they don't want to look foolish in said competitive environment. Or, and again, I'm cautious here, it's often said that boys particularly want to do things practically. And some states, some countries, some jurisdictions, some of the Scandinavian countries, Estonia, for example, would start some of the more formal literacy interventions later and make it more play based to begin with. And I'm cautious about whether that's a boy thing or a girl thing, but I really do think there's something around motivation and self control that in the commission that you're leading, Peter, will really benefit from further research.
That's really interesting. And can we because it's your specialist area, let's look a bit more at creativity and your thoughts on creativity and what that means for schooling, and again with the lens of boys, how that can support boys.
So, creativity for me is a complex disposition. It requires imagination, being inquisitive. It requires the ability to demonstrate that growth mindset I was talking about through perseverance and daring to be different. It definitely requires an ability to collaborate with others because very rarely do we put a cloth on our own head and assume that we alone will have the answer. And it's something that's learnable. This is really important. So it requires discipline. Um, just as becoming a great musician requires disciplined practice, so becoming really creative requires discipline. So it is, I think, truly as noble and complex a concept as science and should be treated as such. Interestingly, Peter, you know, I co chaired the first ever PISA test of creative thinking. And in that test, to come back to your question about boys and girls, we learned something very interesting. Girls, by the way, scored better, as they do on almost everything in the Pearls and Tims and PISA land than boys. And we think that's partly about self belief. It's partly about self efficacy. Girls, by and large, believed that they could be more creative, and it turned out that's a really powerful, almost Pygmalion effect factor. And that was interesting. And girls were also better at perspective taking. So they were more willing, at least these are 15-year-olds, 140,000 15-year-olds. They were better able to see different perspectives. And that's interesting. And my many colleagues across the world are now mining this data to see what we could learn from it.
And have you got an instinct yet? I mean, obviously, it needs more research as to why girls are ahead on this. As you say, they're ahead on quite a lot of things. What is it that you think is leading to these results?
Not really. No. I think this is such an interesting, complex area that whilst I might have come up with an answer before, really enjoying looking again at some of the research because of my participation in the commission, I think it's very, very complex. I think it comes back to understanding what personalization could mean in a school system. And I think there is a gender element to that. But I think there are so many other elements that if we just go down the gender element, I think that could be unhelpful. It is interesting to note, though, that I mean, here's an example, and I may say this later, but it turns out that girls, young women, are actually better at sitting quietly when they're asked to sit quietly. Well, swipe me sideways. That's what we ask kids to do when we test them. So we shouldn't be surprised if girls do better on tests. And they don't do better on all tests, but there's really good research on when you test them on something that requires maths and science and other things, they are better able to sit still and get on with the test, if you like, to concentrate. Now, in a system where a third of our kids fail GCSE English, it should not surprise us that there are very significant, slightly more boys in that cohort who fail. So I'm really interested in us thinking together about how we think radically about a different assessment system. And I know this is something, again, that you and I have thought about a lot, but I'm absolutely more and more convinced that in a penalty shootout world, boys will initially love it and then much more fundamentally dislike it, absent themselves from it, because they may be that last penalty kick taker who's going to let the side down. And therefore, I think we need to reorient the way we value what kids do. It has to be strengths based, it has to be more holistic, and we have to get round this sense that our clutch of GCSEs or BTECs or A levels or any new invention, interesting possible policy developments on that front at the moment might leave us with. So there's a fundamental rethink about assessment needed.
I mean, it's interesting, the assessment argument, because you get other people, and again, as you said earlier, we've got to aim off for what is a sort of hunch or even a prejudice versus the evidence base. And you've been giving an evidence base from PISA and for what you've been saying, which is the OECD measures. But there's also quite a lot of anecdotal evidence, if you're working in schools, as I have, that the boy, if you're doing coursework, which is over time, and you've got to be more conscientious, you often see girls doing better at that. Whereas boys are not bad at sort of turning up for the exam and, if you like, winging it. And if they've, got a basic understanding, can do reasonably well. So that's, I think there's some evidence base behind that. There's a bit of hunch and a bit of anecdotal behind that as well. But some of these things you can cut different ways about, this. The counter to what I've just said is what you just said earlier about boys sitting still for several hours to take the exams. They may be less good at girls. So there's sort of almost conflicting evidence on some of these things, isn't there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just going to agree with you there because I think your
No,
intuitions are
that's
worth exploring. But I wonder whether it's nature or nurture, and I wonder about the power of the environment. I mean, it's an interesting myth, for example, that boys universally prefer male teachers. Turns out they don't. It turns out
yeah.
they prefer good teachers, teachers who really help them to sequence an argument, to understand the steps in a new process. So, we're in myth land here and in hunch land. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think one of the things this commission could do is try and bust some of those myths and look at really promising practices wherever we can find them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We will aim to do that.
Good.
So we've touched on it in the conversation so far. Let's delve a bit deeper into the sort of current curriculum and assessment system. Let's start with the curriculum. What do you think is going wrong in the curriculum, and what would you want to change?
Gosh, well, I've said some of this already. So I think if you simply bound a curriculum by subjects, you're always going to have, unless there's a natural interested individual who says, yeah, I've always wanted to be a scientist or a dancer or an athlete or a geographer. I think you're always going to have that question about to what extent is it the role of the teacher to explain why you're doing something? And why you're doing something because it's on the national curriculum is not enough for many. And I think possibly, again, I'd like to explore this, but I've seen some interesting evidence that suggests in moving from motivation to implementation, boys find that unexplained reason for doing this a challenge. Now, that sometimes leads us to think that, well, the answer is you make everything very interactive, very practical. And again, that's a myth too, because it turns out that girls rather enjoy that too. So I think it's a question of being much more subtle about what, again, I know you and I have spent some time thinking and talking about and trying to implement, namely, what does a really genuine inquiry look like in a school that may transcend a particular subject? What levels of support and input are required, especially for some boys who will find it more difficult to believe that they can do some of these things, it appears. That's that self efficacy, self belief, growth mindset argument. Some boys, too, not all boys, but some boys, and Angela Duckworth and Carol Dweck and Martin Seligman have really interesting research in this area. Um, some boys who will give up a little more quickly than girls, and we need to mold that into something which is suddenly looking really rigorous and worthwhile, and will counter the argument that this is somehow dumbing down what we're doing in school. That not only could this be disadvantaging boys, it could be disadvantaging working class boys and girls, and that need not be the case. And we've got good examples where that is not the case. And I think we need to explore those. So some of these discussions will take us into a potentially sometimes described as a more practical or a more vocational or a more applied curriculum. I think that's useful, providing the level of application is sophisticated and the level of rigor is there. And again, I think this is where we fall down on dumb stereotypes and silly binaries. But I think that's something really worth investigating. And we've investigated that with the Royal Academy of Engineering, looking at the obvious question, which is practical learning of the kind that I've just been describing a better way of teaching and learning, or a more effective way of teaching and learning than more direct instruction? And the answer is no. The answer is, when done well, it's as good. But it gives you something else. Back to our earlier discussion, when done well, you do well on the test, but you also develop some of these life affirming, flourishing dispositions that I think are all centrally about what school is there for. So, in a sense, I think we've been, as academics and practitioners and system leaders, we've been sometimes asking the wrong question. So, if you pitch one process or approach against another, you get a silly answer. But if you then ask the second question, which is the system question, I think you get a more interesting answer. And I think that's what we're going to have to constantly do in this commission.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The word I like on this is repertoire.
Yes. Absolutely.
We get one-dimensional, don't we, in education, that there's one way of teaching, there's one way of learning, there's one type of subject. And actually what you're saying is, if you've got that combination, then and a better diet, both for the teacher and for the young person, then you're in better shape.
I love that, and I use that word too. And I use a very simple, when I'm talking to kids, I use a very simple image, which is, what if every time you got stuck, you had a pair of AI specs with a drop-down menu that said, Bill, this might be the moment to turn and ask a friend, or find it difficult to concentrate, assuming you're allowed to in your classroom, just get up, go and look at what's on the wall over there and come back. Or why don't you just close your eyes and think for a second? Or why don't you take your mind back to some example where you've encountered a similar challenge and done very well at it? And those kind of drop-down tools are, I think, your repertoire. So I think our job is to encourage all of our teacher colleagues to have a richer palette of opportunities, so that we're painting in a much more subtle way in the classroom. And that's the challenge. And if we can do that, then I think we're going to make significant progress. And we don't need to get bogged down into some of the headline debates that you and I have enjoyed exploring.
And it's interesting, that phrase, the richer palette, because it's a phrase in a different context that Jeffrey Boakye talked to me about in the conversation I had with him, where he said we need boys to have a richer palette of emotions that they're allowed to show and ways of being a boy than the ones that are currently on offer at the moment. So there's a thing.
Completely agree with that. Totally agree with that.
Yeah. So there's a thing about breadth in everything we're talking about, isn't there? And about that repertoire.
I think when we think about dispositions, it's sometimes possible to conflate learning dispositions, things that make you a more powerful learner, and things that make you a good person. And an example of that would be um, you would be a prig if you were not happy to share your ideas and work with others in a group in a friendly, open, collaborative kind of way. By the same token, being collaborative and being ready to test yourself against ideas which are not your own, that makes you a good learner. So there's going to be an overlap, but sometimes we conflate these two together.
That's really good. So let's come on to what are the 2 or 3 changes that you would make right now to education to improve it for boys?
Well, the first is an old gramophone record here is to make the teaching and learning of dispositions and complex skills in schools normal, to make it expected, to have the same high standards that we have of the teaching of science and maths. That means we must know what it is. We must draw on good evidence to know where it fits in the curriculum, how best we can cultivate it, how best we can track its development. So we can't think of these as separate, isolated ideas. We need to think right through the food chain of what it is to be a good school. So specifying it, learning how you teach it, learning how the different pedagogies, the repertoire of methods can help you here, and then tracking its development over time and engaging with young people as co-designers sometimes, or as those who can contribute to this to make it more likely that you end up with a cracking question rather than now turn over the exam paper. So that's a fundamental idea. Complex, big, but could be done. And I could show you schools where it's being done now, and it's going to help boys and girls. But if we focus on some of those dispositions, like motivation, like managing distractions, like self control, like some aspects of empathy, it's specifically going to help boys. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think we have to throw out quite a large amount of the current assessment system. It is no longer fit for purpose. And we need, therefore, to re engineer, rethink, reimagine the point of school, and therefore how we might judge whether a school is being successful. And that will lead us to conclude that many of the virtues and attributes that we associate with boys and girls are part of a palette of strengths, back to that word we keep using, that we as a society want our schools to encourage in
Mm.
all young people, because it's only through that way that they're going to flourish. Some of those will be more boyish, and some of those will be more suitable to girls. And again, same argument as the focus argument about which dispositions you particularly highlight. We might want to redress some underemphases as we think about the assessment system. And the third thing I'd like to do, and you could do this tomorrow, is just to inject into the way we transact pedagogy, the teaching and learning that goes on, more practical, interdisciplinary, deep investigations. I see no reason why we can't do that. We have something called the higher project qualification in secondary schools. If you're watching this and you're not a school geek, then it's worth half of what you will know, called a GCSE. Absolutely no reason why all kids should not have that tomorrow, or at least in the next year's academic year. And finally, and this is a challenge to us, Peter, I think we need to be quite humble about those areas where we don't yet have enough data. And we need to go internationally, nationally, locally, regionally, and really understand some of the positive deviants who are doing fantastic work in this space. And if we don't know the answer, I think we've got to be prepared to say that and start having a really interesting conversation.
Brilliant. And finally, a role model for boys. Who would you recommend?
I was thinking about this, and I actually think it would be Sheku Kanu Mason, the most amazing, talented cellist. And it would be him for a number of reasons. Well, he stuck out from that family and he was the boy and he was the initially most successful. But guess what? His whole family is successful. Now, why is that? And I think it's probably because he has an amazing mother and father set of role models. I don't know enough about his grandparental models. And I think there's some tendency to immediately jump to an influencer or a young role model. And I think so often it comes back to your own family. And I think back to my own mum, who taught me to cook at a very early age. And I thank her. She's sadly not with us anymore, but I thank her deeply for that. So that when I got to university, I was one of the few boys who could do something a little bit more complex than boiling an egg.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bill. I really enjoyed the conversation.